my name is Gernot Laganda. I'm the Director of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction at the United Nations World Food Programme. The World Food Programme sees the topic of climate change through the lens of hunger in the world. And there are three big issues that are driving hunger. First one is conflict, second one is climate extremes, and the third one is economic shocks. And of all these three drivers, climate change is the one that is not irreversible, right? We can end conflicts with peace agreements and political engagement. We can have economic policies to buffer economic shocks. But once we have warmed the world by another 1/10 of a degree, we cannot cool it back down. Which means with climate change, we put a little bit more heat under the kettle of risk. And basically it connects with economic, social, political risks. So environmental risks, climate risks are intimately connected with others. And that basically creates social tensions and conflict. When we look at the intersection between climate change and conflict, there are three pathways through which this relationship works. The first one is through resource scarcity. So if climate sensitive natural resources like water becomes scarce in a certain area, and there are different livelihood groups that depend on the same resource, like farmers and herders, for example, in the Sahel, we can have social tensions and conflict. Another pathway is through displacement. So when you have climate extremes displacing people, sometimes they cross borders, other times they come in contact with other hosting communities in the same country. Then you can also have social tensions and conflict. And I would also like to add that there are many big transboundary water basins that transport this very valuable resource, water, through a number of countries. The Nile is an example, the Mekong is an example. So if there are certain water diversion issues upstream, so if basically countries like China build big dams for electricity generation or agriculture, it can be that downstream in the Mekong, in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, you do not have sufficient water, and it's the same with the Nile. So climate change in this regard can also create transboundary conflicts, political conflicts at a higher level. So currently, among the 25 countries which are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, 18 are in conflict. These 18 countries account for only 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but for more than half of the humanitarian need. So there is already a really important interplay here, because if we want to undertake climate action in these countries, we essentially have to deal with a conflict-affected social fabric. Here in COP28, for the first time ever, a presidency has put the issue of climate action in fragile and conflict-affected settings onto the agenda through the COP28 Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, which for us is a very important step to recognize that the most vulnerable people in the world today are in places where climate extremes and conflict already intersect. In conflict-affected countries, we need to work with different mechanisms to provide climate action and climate adaptation, resilience building to local communities. We cannot deliver climate action like we deliver humanitarian aid. The collaboration on climate action in fragile and conflict-affected places needs to happen at the local level. It needs to be anchored with local actors. And we can, in this regard, use our humanitarian pathways, which are normally used to deliver food aid or cash support, also as connectors with local institutions to empower them and enable them with locally led climate change adaptation, locally led disaster risk reduction solutions. So working in conflict-affected states on climate action requires a very different pathway than having a nationally led climate change adaptation strategy and then trying to get the money down to the local level. We need to work much more bottom-up. Here at COP28 there is a big discussion about loss and damage from climate change, and on the very first day there was an approval of a global fund for loss and damage and on financing mechanisms for loss and damage. At the same time there have been pledges, around $725 million were already pledged for the loss and damage fund. But this in itself is not sufficient. When you look at the overall scale of losses and damages in developing economies, we are at a scale of around $400 billion every year in loss and damage. When you compare that with the $725 million that have currently been pledged, it is basically a level not commensurate with the problem. So our message here is that we should not overly focus only on a loss and damage fund. We need to build these lines of defense that currently stand between a warming and overheating planet and a very vulnerable household in a fragile context together. That means the first line of defense being climate change mitigation. We need to make sure that we do not cross that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. I think at the moment here in COP28, in the second week of negotiations, this is the main centerpiece of the discussions. The second line of defense is climate change adaptation. At the moment the funding for adaptation is still too little, too late. The Adaptation Gap Report by the United Nations Environment Programme has shown that there are currently around $21 billion of adaptation financing available to developing countries, while the needs are more than 10 to 15 times as high. So we have a big adaptation gap, and adaptation is not happening at the scale and speed required. So the next line of defense is what we call climate protection, which has a much more immediate focus. That means we are not only looking like on adaptation, what do we need to do now to prepare food systems and livelihoods for a world that is 1.5 degrees warmer. We do not have essentially the time to build climate change adaptation programs with instruments such as the Green Climate Fund, which take 1 or 2 years to prepare and then another 4 or 5 years to deliver. We need to now put those programs in place that have an immediate protective function, reducing losses and damages next season and not only next year or in the year after. And the good news here is that these solutions, they're all available. We know what works in the field. It is generally a combination between ecosystem-based and infrastructure-based protection, but coupled with access to early warning systems, disaster preparedness, contingency planning, and then in many cases financial protection. So even when we work with regenerative agriculture and we try to strengthen the natural resource base, if a big shock is happening, people need some financial support to cope with that shock and to make it through that difficult time. So for us, the solution is really to integrate these three elements: restoration, anticipation, and financial protection.